On November 5th of 2010, I was employed as a Michigan conservation officer, and I took an oath of office to preserve, protect, and defend the state of Michigan and all of the land and the sea, inland sea being the Great Lakes, and all of the animals and fishes and organisms basically in the state of Michigan. So I enforced general criminal law and also all conservation related laws, also including wildlife, including wolves, for example. So in my previous video, I explained how I had had some encounters with wolves, all positive, while being employed as a conservation officer. And just to finish that up, I also helped with a poaching incident where an individual had shot 3 wolves with sarcoptic mange, and I actually rode out with those wolves, endangering myself of getting sarcoptic mange, just to get those animals to where they needed to be for a necropsy and for evidence. So I rode on the sled while my coworker pulled them out by snowmobile. And all of my experiences with wolves were positive. I also fed eagles for many years roadkill deer so that they wouldn't get killed on the roads by car. And inadvertently, coyotes and wolves would come feed on those roadkill deer, either placed out in front of my house on a frozen lake in the wintertime or on my frozen yard living in Epofet Bay in Epofet, Michigan. So I had a lot of wolves come through the area. Actually, one time between my patrol vehicle and my personal vehicle, in between my 2 buildings at my Angels Among Us youth camp, just a few feet from the door. So, and I had already told you about my skiing incident where I had called in wolves with my dying rabbit call when I was cross-country skiing with my dog in the Upper Peninsula, and one wolf tracked me back all the way to my house, and later I found out that my dog had been in heat, so that's why the wolf had followed us. And I never found wolves to be any threat, although I certainly understand that they are predators and that they're capable of killing a human. And they've actually killed a person in Ontario, and they've nearly killed several in Ontario, which is neighboring Michigan. And they've also were shot and killed by a Manitoba game warden when he was in fear of his life. So they certainly can kill people. They've killed people also in a place in Canada. Actually, I believe it was the Northwest Territories as well. And it was a person going out at night from a remote they called it like a work camp of some sort. So I'm not sure if he was there for the oil pipelines or what he was doing, but remote part of the region. And so he actually perished there. Over in Europe, they're attacking a lot more people. Places like even, I think India has the highest rate of wolf fatalities. And so in a lot of those countries, they're not allowed to hunt. Certainly the lay people are not allowed to hunt, and they're the ones that are actually getting killed because they're the ones living in the wilderness areas where wolves live. So, but my experiences had all been positive, and I, just had never had a negative experience with wolf, wasn't afraid of them, wasn't afraid to call them in. I've also called in moose before when I wasn't hunting them, just to see the moose, just to photograph them, just to video them. And I love to see nature, whether I've got a camera or a video camera, or I just have it in my mind's eye. So on November 5th of 2010, I was sitting on this bluff. I made a dying rabbit call. The 2 young of the year wolves turned and ran right towards me. I was actually downwind of them, so they didn't wind me, which I didn't really realize the wind direction until a little bit later when they kept approaching. I realized there's obviously no way they're scenting me. So one at a time, each young of the year wolf, which is a year and a half old at that time, jumped up onto the 7-foot bluff that I was seated on. I'm seated back a little bit, so I'm leaned up against a little poplar tree, and my ankles are crossed. My M1A 308 rifle is seated with the weight off of my 12-point tactical sling, so it's just kind of resting crosswise on my lap. It's now become a single shot because I recently had just lost my magazine, my 5-round magazine, and I was going to be heading back to my vehicle to try to retrieve extra ammo and to backtrack to see if maybe I could find where I might have lost the magazine while crossing blowdowns in this rugged Canadian Shield country. So one at a time, those 2 young of the year jumped up onto the bluff. Suddenly they're looking at me eye to eye. And as they do so, they kind of flinch like that because they didn't smell me, so they didn't see me till we were looking eyes locked on one another. I didn't run because I didn't want them to think I was prey. I didn't scream because I just didn't know what to do. I basically chose to freeze and see what would happen. Looking back on it, maybe if I would have yelled and screamed, it would have scared them off. But I just didn't really know what to do. They talk to you a lot about what to do with bears, but I wasn't really familiar with what to do with wolves that were 8 yards from me. So the first wolf did that, and then he turned around and he silently jumped back down, not completely at the base of the bluff, just out a little ways, so that I could actually see him where the other wolf was waiting. The other wolf then ran up, jumped up, did the exact same thing. He wasn't alerted at all by the first wolf what had happened in any communication that I could hear anyway. So he jumped up, he did the exact same thing and kind of flinched like that, and I probably just about pooped my pants because suddenly I'm 8 feet from the second wolf and it did the exact same thing. It was silent, I was silent. It, as quick as it jumped up, it jumped back down, stood right next to its sibling, and stood their ground. As the other 18 of their friends emerged from the woods, sort of like gorillas in the mist. They were absolutely silent. They were running right towards me. They were silent. They were amazing hunters. They weren't even like moving branches or breaking a stick or doing anything, leaving no sign of their existence, just running towards me. And they weren't necessarily hunting me at that point, those 18, because actually they hadn't even winded me yet. They got to where 4 of them, in my mind's eye, are right over here. The rest of them are out front, kind of scattered roughly in about this degree of kind of radiation from the center of my body. 4 of them start to flank me. And that's when things got really, really creepy and really, really scary and emotional really fast. Because they're flanking me, and I'm looking, and suddenly, you see your life flash before your eyes, and you wonder what's going to happen. And the reality, the totality of the circumstances kind of weighs on your shoulder suddenly and in your mind. And time seems to slow, and you see these wolves, and you see them kind of stop, and they stopped right in their tracks, those 4 that were flanking me, and they slowed to a stealthy walk. They would take a step and then kind of look around, and they were winding me at that time. But they didn't know exactly where I was, so they were sort of walking slowly, flanking me and coming closer. They were, I would say, approximately 100 yards at the most off to my left at that time, and they're kind of coming in closer, but kind of angled back this way. And if you're not familiar with predators' actions, they'll flank you and then come up from the rear, and that's when they attack. So I just wasn't sure what was going to happen. I was there by myself. I'm 16 hours plus from my family, my friends. I didn't think I had any cell signal. I was in a really remote area. I never dreamed I would have any cell signal way out there. So I just felt alone. I felt isolated. I didn't know what to do. I knew I only had 1 shot in my gun, and I didn't know if it'd make a difference. I didn't know if they would stop, if they were going to attack me, if they were going to eat me. Predator and prey dangled in a delicate balance, and I didn't know what end that I would end up on. So I made a choice, and my choice was actually in slow motion based on several things. I thought about it. It wasn't a split-second reaction. It probably was, but in my mind it didn't feel as so. So I pulled my gun up and I took a shot, and I tried to shoot one that was a little larger. I was looking for the Alpha or the Omega, except they were back far enough, and my gun was shaking. I've never had that kind of buck fever, they call it. And I mean, my gun was literally shaking like this, and I kept thinking, well, I've got to control my breathing because I'm never even going to hit anything. And so I figured if I shot one, at least they probably wouldn't prey upon their own kind right away. They might if they got hungry. So I figured that if they killed me, there might not be anything left except for my gun. I've heard stories of them eating everything, including clothing and even shoes, or sometimes finding a shoe a quarter mile away. And I knew that no one would find me where I was. There wasn't a soul on the planet that knew where I was. And I was so far from anywhere that they wouldn't find me easily. if at all, ever, with like a search party or a flying search party. The only way they might possibly find me in that rugged terrain, that Canadian Shield country with 100,000 lakes and 14,000 islands in that district of Ontario, would be by sheer luck. And if all they saw was a gun, they might erroneously think that I wandered off. So those were the thoughts I ran through my mind. And I remember thinking my friends would never believe it, but the authorities would probably be convinced that I just left my gun and was lost somewhere. And never would they know it really was my fate. So I pulled the trigger. I didn't have a wolf tag, but I pulled the trigger and a wolf fell. And afterwards, my adrenaline was pumping. I was absolutely ecstatic. Not that I had killed a wolf, but that I had survived. Because what happened next was the wolves kind of had a standoff with me for what seemed like an eternity. And I really can't even estimate how long it was. Maybe 4 minutes, maybe 30 seconds. I don't know. It just seemed like an eternity in my mind. And they stood there silently. They were looking at me, but it wasn't like they really registered exactly what I was. They heard the bullet, they saw their friend fall, and they just froze. And I thought, are they still going to come? So out of my peripheral vision, I could still see the four to my left, flanking me. So they were stopped at this point, probably 70, 75 yards off to my left. And it would have been very easy for them to completely come from behind and circle me. So they had winded me at that point. Those four had, and they were just froze right in their tracks. And they were actually the first ones to turn wheel and leave, and the rest waited and left after that. So right now I'm at 11 minutes and 49 seconds. So I'm going to stop this and do a third subsequent video of what happened next.